Trump seems to throw in the towel. After talking from 2023 about how he was going to end this war in a day, and he knew Putin, he knew Zelensky, he knew how to bring it to an end, and well, then wasn't it one day, 100 days, and then, well, a few days, and then, okay, a couple of weeks, and then 50 days, and now then today we've shortened it back again. Now it's to 12 days because, as Trump says, he's just kind of getting tired of this whole thing. I mean, he's just bored with talking, I think, is how it's going to turn out to be. We're going to try to find out what is the ramifications of this, what is the significance of this new twist and new change by Trump, and how's everybody going to respond, both in Europe and in Russia, because that's where everything matters the most, and, of course, what kind of reaction Ukraine may have to this. And to try and unpack a lot of this, we have one of our great guests on today, Colonel Jacques Baud, former member of the Swiss Strategic Intelligence Service and NATO officer. Colonel, as always, glad to have you back on today.
Very glad to be with you also. Nice to be back on your show. Thanks.
It is always a pleasure to have you here. And boy, the timing couldn't have been any better that we had you scheduled to come on today. Because first of all, I just kind of want to know what your thoughts are on this bombshell drop that Trump made just hours ago. And actually, for anybody who may not have been familiar with it, I guess before we get your thoughts, let me show people what he actually said.
You know, Russia could be so rich right now. Instead, they spend all their money on war. They spend everything on war and killing people, and it doesn't make sense to me. I thought he would want to end this thing quickly. I really felt it was going to end, but every time I think it's going to end, he kills people.
Could a meeting help, and are you considering it? Has been proposed?
I don't know. I'm not, I'm not so interested in talking anymore.
He's not so interested in talking anymore. It really sounds tired there, like he's tired of talking, etc. But let me just back up a little bit. What do you make of his contention that I thought we had a deal several times? I thought we were going to make something happen, and then all of a sudden he starts killing people. What do you make of that? Because it's hard for me to reconcile that with what we know about what was said.
Well, first of all, tell me something I don't know, because that was so expected. You know, nobody understood really what was the purpose of those 50 days. There were a lot of theories, explanations, speculation, but nobody really gave a rationale or an explanation for those 50 days. Now he wants to shorten that to 10 to 12 days. I mean, this is just hip shooting. You know, there is no real thinking behind this, I think. He just wants to have a deal. That's what he wants to have. And the problem is that when he came into office early this year, he thought that he could impose the Keith Kellogg solution. That means freezing the conflict, because that's in substance that's what he had in mind. The problem is that nobody really understood exactly what the Russians wanted, and nobody tried to understand what Vladimir Putin said. And I just want to show here, that's what Vladimir Putin said on the 14th of June last year. And he said, he gave the two conditions to start a negotiation. So meaning that for the Russians, any kind of ceasefire and all that should happen into a process, while in the Keith Kellogg concept, as well as what the Ukrainians want, I mean Zelensky wants, they just want a ceasefire of 30 days, period. There is no indication that it could lead to something, or it could expand into something, or it could help to have negotiation and all that. No, it's just a ceasefire, period. And if you listen to European leaders, for instance, they tend to associate the word ceasefire to the word peace. I mean, they say Vladimir Putin doesn't want a ceasefire, so he doesn't want peace. But the ceasefire as such has nothing to do with peace in the mind of the Europeans. It's just a pause in the conflict. If you read what Vladimir Putin said last year, you see something very different. And you can see the Ukrainian troops must be completely withdrawn. Nota bene, he doesn't say they want to conquer that. He may also accept if the Ukrainians leave the area. Withdrawn from the Donetsk, Luhansk, People's Republic, and Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions. As soon as Kiev declares that it's ready to make this decision and begin a real withdrawal of troops from this region, and also officially notifies that it abandons its plan to join NATO, our side will follow in order to cease fire and start negotiation, and so on. So meaning that the two conditions, the two preconditions to have a ceasefire and a negotiation process is for the Ukrainians to accept to withdraw from those 4 regions, and to accept the idea of not being part of NATO. And if you study that carefully, you will see that what the 4 regions, that this is part of the concept or the objective of denazification, because in essence, the purpose of that is to put the Russian population of those regions outside of the Ukrainian law that in fact gives different rights to the Ukrainians and to the Russians. You have this law of the 1st of July 2021 that gives different rights to Russians as other inhabitants of Ukraine, and therefore and that was explained by Sergei Lavrov, by the way, that retaining those 4 regions is in fact a way to protect the population of those regions from this law that doesn't grant them all the human rights and all the constitutional rights that the normal Ukrainians should have. That's the first one. And the second one, to abandon the plans to join NATO. This is what Vladimir Putin defined as demilitarization. In fact, we have here the 2 objectives that were defined on the 24th of February, and of the 20th February 2022. So we are here in front of a declaration of Putin, which is absolutely consistent with everything he has said up to now. And the problem is that the West never wanted to acknowledge that, and all the attempts that were made by Trump and his team, including Steve Witkoff, by the way, they never addressed these points. They always try to convince Vladimir Putin to accept this ceasefire without any process related to that. And that's the reason why Vladimir Putin says no, he doesn't want a ceasefire. He will provide the ceasefire once we have addressed the 2 first preconditions that were defined there. So that's in essence the problem that the West faces. The West doesn't want to acknowledge what the Russians have said. And the problem is that since the Russians are winning on the ground, I mean, everything we hear from Trump and from the West is only delusion, meaning that yes, it's only that, because the reality on the ground is that the Russians are winning.
Well, and that's what this detailed explanation you just gave, going all the way back to June 2024, and you could probably even gone back further than that if you wanted to. The Russian side has been unambiguous, not hidden, shouted from the rooftops multiple times, and we could certainly add Sergei Lavrov and several others to that. Nebenzia from the United Nations Security Council speeches he's given time to time. But then today, Trump said in one of his comments there was that I just don't understand where they're coming from. I thought we would have a deal before, but for some reason that they're not going to. And it puzzles me how you can not understand why Russia hasn't had a deal to the benefit of Kiev when all the things you just laid out there. And I don't know if it's just wishful thinking or what it is.
Well, that's the problem of the West. I mean, there is a kind of sometimes I feel that the West is living in a parallel world somehow. We don't even take into consideration what the Russians are doing. And if the Russians were losing then you could say, okay, that should go on the Ukrainian terms or US terms or European terms. But it's not the case. Russians are winning. And the problem is that since the West doesn't want to address those questions and doesn't want to address the ceasefire in the framework of a larger process, and here I just showed what Putin said last year, but if you read the memorandum that was given to the Ukrainian delegation on the 2nd of June this year in Istanbul, it details exactly those points. So the Russians have been absolutely clear about all that, but nobody wants to even start to engage with this memorandum. As a result, we are talking, we are not communicating, we are just bypassing each other. As a result, the Russians are continuing their progress on the ground. They are continuing to grind down the Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainian forces are, they are reduced materially, physically, personally, and all that every day. And we will find a point, and that's also probably why the Russians are very keen to have negotiations, because they understand that if we wait, Ukraine will withdraw and they will reach a point where the Russians don't want to move ahead. The Russians don't want to go in the western part of Ukraine. They may go, if we look at a map, and I will try to provide here a map just to show where we sorry, I have to, it probably easier to explain with the map. And where we are, here we are. Okay, here, this is a map of forget this little flag here for now, but here you have in red, you have the more or less the area which is currently occupied by Russians. In here, reddish outlined is what the Russians call Novorossiya, which are in essence the four regions: Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk, plus the region of Odessa, Nikolaev, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kharkov. And all this together makes Novorossiya. And some say that Novorossiya might be what the Russians may agree to occupy or to take. But so that means that they may cross the Dnieper here and take Nikolaev and Odessa. But they certainly don't want to go in this area. And if you read my last book on covert wars in Ukraine, you can understand why, because here in my book, I publish maps that were drawn in the late 50s by the CIA at a point when the CIA was planning to deploy special forces in Ukraine. And you could see that this area here, in the very western part of Ukraine, this area, which in fact coincide exactly with where the nationalists are still today in this area. This area was considered by the CIA in the late 50s as the one which is the most anti-Russian or anti-Soviet. And the Russians today still know that, and they don't want to go into this area, meaning that there is a point of balance, I could say, between the advance of the Russians and the maximum point where they want to go, because there is a point where they don't want to go. And this might be the Dnieper. The Dnieper goes a little bit here along this line here. That might be this line here. but the Russians definitely don't want to go here.
So let me ask you a question though on that. Let's say that Russia, no deal is done. The Ukraine side never agrees to any of the terms from June 14th or from the Istanbul in June of this year, and Russia moves up to take Novorossiya. Now then, that still leaves them with an unrepentant Ukraine on its flank, still open to potentially have bilateral, even I consider the idea of getting NATO into whatever's left of the rump of Ukraine. What is Russia's situation then? And meaning, can they just go up to Novorossiya and then stop?
Well, I think that's what they probably want to do, because they don't want to go beyond that. They don't want to occupy the whole, because if they go in the western part, even if we see now that even in the western part of Ukraine, you have less and less people who are keen to defend the country. That's very interesting. If you look at the polls that were made at the very beginning, I mean, just before, in fact, the Russian special military operations, you could see that the part of Ukraine that was the most keen to defend the country with arms, I mean, to have armed defense, were obviously in the western part. And the part that was very reluctant to take arms to defend against Russia were obviously the south and the eastern part, that's where the Russians are today. That explains why you don't have popular resistance against the Russians, because the population never actually wanted to defend Ukraine with arms in these areas. But that would be a totally different music if you go in the western part of the country. And even if today we see that a lot of people have left the country, even nationalists, and the willingness to fight the Russians has considerably reduced in this area. Nevertheless, let's say if you assume that Russia would occupy the whole of the territory, you would still have a hard time in the western part, because you would have partisan groups and guerrilla, and that would be exactly as we had in the 50s up to the early 60s, that this guerrilla movement would be supported by Western intelligence, CIA, MI6, you name it, exactly as the West did after the Second World War. And in fact, the Western countries, I mean, UK, US, and France, supported those partisan movements up to the early 60s in Ukraine. And even using those soldiers, there were Ukrainian soldiers that belonged to the Waffen SS. They made up the 14th Grenadier SS Division Galizien, or Erste Galizien. That was a SS division in which you had all these Ukrainians. And they surrendered to the British in 1945. And the British, instead of putting those soldiers into jail and making them trial them for war crimes and all that, the British kept them in order to support or to re-inject them into Ukraine for subversion purposes. That's very interesting that in 1946...
So let's say from 1946 until you said the early 60s, what was accomplished by then? If you can say what was the outcome, whatever was intended,
Not
what was
much.
the outcome for the West during that period of time?
Nothing. Really nothing. I mean, it was guerrilla warfare. You had infiltration of agents and spies, and you had the guerrilla. I mean, in all these areas. I mean, and not just in Ukraine. You had that also in the Baltic state, in Lithuania and in Estonia. You had a guerrilla movement that were supported militarily. You had, as you had in France during World War II, you had night flights dropping weapons and ammunition in over Soviet Union. We were in the 50s, you know, the air defense was not so developed, and you had probably not air radar as you may have today. So the situation was a little bit different. You had also infiltration by land also. And but this didn't lead to, that was more the idea of destabilizing the country rather than having a concrete outcome, taking over regions or things like that. And in fact, this didn't lead to anywhere in reality, but that was done, and that lasted almost 20 years. And all the issue, I mean, you may remember the spying with Philby and all these MI5 people that were taken by discovered the spying, this Soviet spying in the British intelligence. They were linked to that because, in fact, they when the Western powers dropped agents or combatants by parachuting them by night, those agents within the UK intelligence were informing the KGB in Russia. So when when those agents were dropped in Ukraine or in any other parts, Albania and the Baltic state, you had a welcome committee taking them upon landing, and I mean, that was part of this dirty war that was conducted just after the Second World War, but again without substantial results, in fact.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of one of the issues. And I want to get more on that in just a second. But I can imagine that some of that stuff is in the minds of the Russian today. That memory is a lot sharper for them than it is for us about what happened in that period of time. When you combine that with what's happening right now, we've shown you what President Trump said earlier today about, now we're going from 50 days to 10 or 12 days, something like that. And before he's going to try to start doing some more sanctions. Earlier today, a video was released by Sergei Lavrov. So before Trump had made those comments, but he was laying out for his audience just how he views the West and why they're pursuing this conflict so hard. Here's what he said specifically about Europe.
The Europeans are seriously trying to defeat us. I think this is confirmed every day. The new Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, Mr. Merz, said, I don't know if he understands what he said, that we must once again make Germany the largest military force in Europe. It was the largest military force on the eve of the First World War, on the eve of the Second World War, when it was also unleashed. And now he wants to make Germany the first military force in Europe again. And his defense minister, Mr. Pistorius, said that if necessary, the Germans will undoubtedly kill Russian soldiers. This is perceived in the European elites almost as a matter of course. In the Cold War, there was mutual respect. Now there is no respect. Europe has simply gone mad.
That's a pretty strong statement there. He says Europe has simply gone mad. He has specifically referred to the Germans there. The Germans have also physically put troops into the Baltic regions closer to the Russian territory there. You just had the U.S. General Donahue last week boast about how easily we could take down Kaliningrad, where Russia has some of its nuclear weapons. So kind of important to the Russian side there. He sees this U.S. defense budget going up to $1 trillion in the next fiscal year. You have an $800 billion so-called advance rebuild Europe program, et cetera. Does Russia have some reason to be worried about the West?
Well, it has. I mean, what we see today is more or less the continuation of what we had after the Second World War and during the Cold War. You know, there is some kind of revanchism. I don't know if I pronounce it correctly. Revanchism,
yeah.
Revanchism in the German mentality, and you see the people. Incidentally, if you look at the family of Ursula von der Leyen, Kaja Kallas, Friedrich Merz, and all that, all these people had something to do with Soviet Union at what time, and there is probably something there which is which relates more to psychiatry rather than to politics. But the fact of the matter is that there is this idea that Russia should be defeated in some way. And I mentioned this guerrilla movement in the western part of Ukraine just after World War II. But you know that a lot of those movements were led by former SS officers from the so-called Wehrwolf. The Wehrwolf organization was a kind of a clandestine guerrilla organization that was set up by the SS during World War II. And some of these officers remained active in Ukraine for years. And it's not a surprise if today, if you look at the emblem of the Ukrainian special forces, it's a werewolf. I mean, I don't know exactly how you translate that in English, but this is this wolf that it's a mythical animal that you had in the legends, European legends. And the werewolf remains the emblem of the special forces and the special units of the military intelligence in Ukraine today. So there are a lot of ties with what happened just in World War II. So I wouldn't be surprised if some people will still contemplate this idea of continuing some kind of destabilization work through a covert action. And remember that, and even the New York Times reported on that just after the Maidan revolution in 2014, you had the CIA that came into Ukraine, and they started to establish some kind of stay-behind organization. You see, those there were mentioned some 12 bases, forward operating bases along the border. These have probably been long be detected or found by the Russians, but the individuals were trained for stay-behind operation. That means that these guys are organized, and probably some are still operating. And when we have those actions in Belgorod and all that, you may probably have some individuals that have been trained by the CIA. There are local people specially trained to survive in enemy environment, and who are able to set up operations in the rear of the Russians. And we may well have exactly the same scenario playing if the Russians would move westwards in Ukraine. So I see that probably a lot of people are contemplating that. And the concern of the Russians is serious, but that's also explained why the Russians probably don't want, and in fact, they have said they don't want to go in the western part of Ukraine. And nobody knows exactly where they have set the limit. I would see the limit around the Dnieper, because that's a kind of a natural border, if you want.
Yeah.
But there is no indication for that. I mean, this is my own speculation. What we can say is that probably the Russians would try to get the oblast of Odessa. If we go back to the map, we can see that Odessa here, that is this area here, is close to Moldova. And here in Moldova, you have just here in the eastern part of Moldova, you have Transnistria, where you have a very strong Russian community. So taking over Odessa could help to bridge the gap between Transnistria and the rest of Ukraine. So we may well have this operation, probably Nikolaev as well. I mean, the Russians are already in the area of Dnipropetrovsk. So we could have this move towards Novorossiya. But, well, beyond Novorossiya, I don't know, to be honest. This is speculation of me.
Right. And at the same time that Lavrov is talking about that they are afraid that Ukraine is going to, or sorry, that Europe is against them. They obviously are fighting with Ukraine, etc. You had a lot of news in the United States here in just the last couple of days that from CNN a couple of days ago that there was a lot of military construction going on inside Russia with their drone factories, especially just massive new capabilities is still being constructed, i.e. what they have already is going to expand further, where they could get up to 1,500, possibly 2,000 of these guaranteed drones, plus other. Here's some of the satellite imagery released by the CNN that shows new facilities being built in Russia. Then we already know they're continuing to build missile and rocket forces, etc. So Russia doesn't appear to be getting close to culmination or anything else. Yet at the same time, you have Trump saying, I'm tired of talking. You have the frustration on the Russian side, and Sergei Lavrov in that same speech there, he lamented that Russia had been willing to and has tried to engage in diplomacy of their own.
When they began to destroy everything Russian, of course, we could not stay aside. We tried to negotiate, but it did not work out. Therefore, there was no alternative to starting a special military operation. We do not care about territories.
But yet they obviously do care about their national security, so they wanted to negotiate. We weren't willing to. We've bypassed all the diplomatic offerings that have had, and now then you see physically they're making plans for and capabilities for increased military cooperation or activity. Are you concerned that this war could potentially escalate?
Well, not really escalate, but I think Ukraine will be destroyed. I mean, there will not be an escalation in the sense that I don't think what the Russians are aiming to is to enlarge, to have more countries involved or things like that. But they will continue to advance. And the problem comes from the West, because since the West doesn't consider any diplomatic solution to the conflict, they may, as we say in French, flee forward. It's a flight, Flucht nach vorne. That means that you flee but forward. That means you tend to escalate, and that's what we hear in the rhetoric, at least from the West. They try to rearm Europe. First of all, they want to spend money in developing a new military-industrial complex in the whole of Europe. They are talking about, as you mentioned before, taking over Kaliningrad or things like that. So we see that the European rhetoric is not about finding other solutions. I mean, in the area of diplomacy or political arrangement or things like this. No, there is no discussion. The option of talking is totally excluded. And we have seen that, by the way, in the very last meeting in Istanbul, where there was not a single attempt from the Ukrainians as well as the Western parties to engage the Russian proposal, I mean the Russian memorandum. And that's exactly what we said at the very beginning of this show, that they are not even considering the Russian proposal, meaning that from the Russian side, they want to discuss, but they see that there is no response on the Western side, meaning that the Russians will continue to advance. And again, there are two objectives: denazification, demilitarization. I explained that demilitarization at strategic level includes that the idea that Ukraine is not part of NATO. But at operational level, it means exactly what General Surovikin said in October 2022. That means to destroy systematically the Ukrainian military potential. And that's exactly what they are doing. That's why they are not proceeding very fast. We know that the Russians can proceed extremely fast. You remember in the very first days of the special military operation, they could launch deep operations in the north and in the south, in the Kherson area and in the Sumy up to Kiev area. They could do that. In the center, they didn't, because this is also something we have probably to, some people don't understand all the time, but we have probably to go to the map. Sorry, I will go to another map. Again, sorry about the delay, but
Oh, no worries at all. Yeah, always glad to get a chance to look at your map there.
Here we go. This was the first phase of the special military operation, and we had, in fact, the main effort was not carried by Russian forces, but you had in fact 3 armies attacking on that day, on the 24th of February. You had the Dnipro Popular Army and the Luhansk Popular Army. And those were poorly equipped. And that's the reason why people said the Russians were poorly prepared. They had the poor communication and all that. And there was no common command at this stage. There was just a coordination between those and the Russian forces that were both in the south and in the north. And you could see that the Russians were able to go very deep up to this area here, westwards of Kiev, and they also reach Kherson in the south. So the Russians are able to go in deep operations. And since September 2022, they integrated those 2 armies into the Russian forces. And since then, we can talk about Russian forces, really. But before that, you had, in fact, 3 armies, as I said. And now those armies are brought up to the standards of the Russian army. So meaning that the Russians would be able, in theory, to make very deep strikes across Ukraine, but they don't want to do that. The name of the game for the Russians is not to reach the depth of Ukraine, is to destroy the military potential. And that's what the Western powers or Western countries have not understood. Now the Russians are in the process of destroying methodically, systematically the Ukrainian potential. And we see all the problem with the personnel, with the equipment and all that. That belongs to this idea of the operational demilitarization of Ukraine. And the Russians will continue that up to the point where you don't have combatants anymore. So there will be a point, again, I talk about the balance point, where the Ukraine will have no army, no combatant anymore, no more.
And I know this is almost impossible to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What is your best assessment for how much longer that could take? I mean, we've had 3.5 years, and the Ukraine army has still maintained its solvency. How much longer can they go?
Well, there are different issues here at play, because here we are talking about the military, I mean, the pure military side. But of course, you have other aspects that are at play. I mean, how is the reaction of the Ukrainian population? We have seen that recently you had some moves within the population. You have what I have mentioned, or we have mentioned briefly during this this show, that you have all the resistance movement that exists in Ukraine, and probably we can go back to a map. And here, I show here a map. This is the map of before. But if we go deeper, we can see that you have a lot of resistance movement that are currently operating in the area of Zaporizhzhia, and they go very far away. They reach even the area of Rovno here in the western part of the country. Here you have this movement here in yellow is the movement Dozor. And Dozor is not a Russian movement. It's a Ukrainian resistance movement. I mean, a Ukrainian movement against Kiev. Here you have the Kherson, the Ruski Kherson, and which is a Russian movement, meaning it's made up of ethnic Russians fighting in in Ukraine here.
But ethnic Russians who are Ukrainians. So is that correct in
Yes,
that
yes,
area?
they have Ukrainian citizenship, but they are Russians. I mean, the ethnic Russians. Yeah, but by passport, their passport is a Ukrainian, but they are fighting for the Russians
And
because
so, by the way, is this the kind of stuff that you cover some in that new book over your shoulder there from last month, the covert wars in Ukraine? Is that what we're talking
yes,
about here?
exactly. Yes, that's what I'm detailing all that with all the characteristics of this movement and all that. And you have here, you also have this movement in Nikolaev, which is a very huge movement. And you have Sergei Lebedev, who is the coordinator of all these movements here, and you have other ones that are very much smaller or do not have any name, which are operating into this area. And when you have, for instance, strikes, missile strikes or drone strikes on convoys, like railway transports that bring weapons from the west, from Poland to the central Ukraine. I mean, you have a lot of sabotage action on the railway done by those resistance groups, even Dozor. And you have, again, this is a Ukrainian movement, but they cooperate with the Russian movement inside Ukraine, meaning that now you have a kind of unity, if you want, of those different movements against Kiev, and they exchange information. And the rationale for the Ukrainians to fight is mostly this forced recruitment that the Ukrainian army is doing, and that is the rationale for mobilizing these partisans here. But they cooperate with the Russians, and you see, and probably you have seen that last week, that the Russians attacked with missiles. They attacked a recruitment center of Ukraine, and the Ukrainian resistance movement thanked the Russian forces for having attacked this recruitment center. So you see that you have slowly a very complex resistance organization that's
Well, in fact, I was going to ask you because you'd mentioned earlier in the show about some of the planning that has happened historically here, but also from the West, CIA, et cetera, but that there was also some open talk prior to the beginning of the special military operation that the Russians call this war, that we were going to do the same thing here. But that was from the West against the Russian. But now that you're showing that there is either, I don't know if it's a competing, if it's an equal, if it's a subordinate movement that's pro on the Russian side against the Western side in there. And so how do you see
absolutely.
these two organizations competing in the same space?
Well, I don't exactly know how they probably fight each other, and that explains probably a lot of those uh, um, attacks that you have in some villages, and you have bomb attacks and things like this, because probably you have competing partisan movement fighting each other. That there are some indications of that, but this is not widely reported in the West.
Yeah.
But what we see mostly is that these partisan movement are, again, they are, how to say that, they are trained, and you have obviously Russian special forces training some elements of those partisan movement. But it's not, this partisan movement must not be understood as a whole population that that reacts against Kiev. These are a lot of small guerrilla groups scattered that operate against very specific objectives. It's very interesting to see that the Russians, at the very beginning of the special military operation, issued recommendation to the Russians in Ukraine. I mean, not just in the occupied part of Ukraine, but in the Kievian part of Ukraine, if you want. And the Russians said, don't, to the population, don't take part to the Russian partisan organization, because then there will be reprisal against civilians and all that. So don't do that, but do some kind of civil society resistance. You jam the copy machine, or you spend gas stupidly. You create leakage of things, small things, but not partisan action, because the Russians want to avoid reprisal against the population. So what we have in these areas that I've shown on the map, this is not popular movement. These are areas where you have a lot of small groups operating more or less independently under the direction of Russian Spetsnaz, special forces, and that are providing mostly humans. A lot of those strikes that are performed, I mean, the missile strikes and drone strikes performed by the Russians, especially against covert workshops where they build these drones and things like this. There's a lot of small workshops scattered in cities, sometimes in apartment buildings and all that. These are the kind of things you cannot detect with satellite imagery or things like this, or even with SIGINT or things like this. You need
how
to
much
have
does that really help the Russian military on the line of contact?
Say again?
How much does that actually help the Russian forces
a lot
on their side?
A lot. I cannot quantify this, but apparently it's very substantial what this resistance movement bring, and we see that because very often in the Russian media you have Sergei Lebedev, who is the coordinator of this movement. And you can see, for instance, when the Ukrainians prepared to attack in Kursk region, you remember last August, 1 year ago. Now the resistance movement in Nikolaev, they detected the movement of some troops up north, and they informed the Russians that such and such units were moved north, most probably to attack Kursk. And for that reason, the Russians deployed the Akhmat battalion, special forces, and so on in the area of Kursk and the nuclear power plant in close to Kursk, in order to protect them. And they were prepared when the Ukrainians launched their offensive in Kursk. The Russians were perfectly aware of that, and they left those troops enter Russia, and they create some kind of a kill zone, if you want, a huge killing zone. But that was a calculated movement, in fact. But the whole information came from Sergei Lebedev and his organization.
Wow,
so
that's fascinating.
So
let me ask you this: in the last few minutes we have available here, I want to circle back to kind of the bigger picture here, where Trump's saying that 10 or 12 days our patience could be over. What do you think is going to happen? And this say that he actually means what he says this time, and in 12 days Trump levies these secondary sanctions on China, India, Brazil, etc. Is that going to compel Russia to do anything differently?
No, I don't think so. I mean, in fact, those sanctions are directed at the allies of Russia, not directly at Russia. I mean, they are targeting India, China, as you said. And I'm not sure that China, India would accept that. And therefore, my personal view is that this will not change the plans of Russia. And that will not even change the support provided by those countries to Russia. I mean, India will continue to buy Russian oil, and China will continue to buy Russian gas and oil and whatever they buy to Russians. But what it will do, it will probably accelerate the how to say that, the separation, if you want, between India from the US, and that will probably contribute to isolate US more, in my view.
Yeah.
I don't think that the Chinese will accept to be coerced in a policy matter, because they consider that's there. And if you listen to what Wang Yi and Xi Jinping has said many times to the representative of the European Union and even the Americans, they have said that's their foreign policy. They have ties with Russia. They know that if they comply with the US and if they cut their ties with Russia, then they will be the next online for the sanctions and all that, meaning that they have absolutely, there is no incentive for them to comply with
Right.
what the US want. As a result, I don't know exactly what US has in mind, in fact, because applying those tariffs of 500% and all that, that will simply isolate US more than it is, and
Right.
that will accelerate the unification. If I can, probably unification is a very strong word, but yes, let's use that word for. But the unification of BRICS and all that, I will consolidate the exchanges among the BRICS rather than with the West. So the West is again shooting
Itself in the
in
foot,
the
and
feet. Exactly.
in the knee, and the wrist. Yeah, we just
Exactly.
we keep
Everything.
harming ourselves more and more. And then we have this. Thanks, Gary. This is the first reaction that we've seen out of the Russian side. Dmitry Medvedev says Trump's playing the ultimatum game with Russia, 50 days or 10. He should remember two things. Russia isn't Israel or Iran. Each new ultimatum is a threat, a step towards war, not between Russia and Ukraine, but with his own country. Don't go down the Sleepy Joe road. Yeah, well, that's kind of expected, and I think kind of has the interest or the intent, whether what you just said. So good timing on that one. Listen, though, but we really appreciate you coming on. Always a pleasure to have you on, because you have such fascinating things to say, and so much deep knowledge about the situation. So thank you so much for coming on today.
That was my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thanks.
And just for anybody who's interested there, this Covert Wars in Ukraine, that's available online. And a lot of interesting things there. Not many in the West know about that. So I'm going to get that one myself. So recommend that to other people. And also, just to let you guys know, we are on podcast. Some of your friends may prefer to get their information via podcast. Be sure and send them to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict. Type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive and they'll find us there. And then we're also now expanding into the written word. We have a Substack office or offering now. You can find that at Gary, if you can put that one up there. I think it's DanielDavisDeepDive.substack.com. It's all one word. We're we host a lot of videos, but we also do it in written form. There's some op-eds and some other things in there for those who like to get their information through the written media. We're expanding our universe so that we have many ways for you or your friends to find out of the truth, the unintimidated, uncompromised truth that our channel brings, so that you will be informed of the truth that's out there. Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.